official assaults against any religious rights, for example, against the Ashura parades, arrests and imprisonment of the reciters, threatening their religious rights in general. However, the most important official measures taken, double standards in dealing with the religious freedoms, because restrictions were implemented against the Shiite religious rights, because most of the Shiite clerics in Bahrain have gathered and took the decision to take the highly health precautions for the gatherings. And they have provided this decision to the government. However, the government still restricted the religious freedoms in practicing those rights. Restrictions against the religious rights and employment of the COVID-19 against the religious rights as religious persecution in order to abolish the Shiite identity in Bahrain. These unjust acts were related to the other policies implemented by the government in a strong deterioration for human rights and also in depriving a lot of Bahraini nationals of their nationalities. We witness a lot of campaigns by the Bahraini government for religious tolerance. However, when we go to the field, we find how the government failed in doing any of the reforms and in implementing their pledges, because the Bahraini constitution and the laws grant the people the freedom to express, freedom to religion, freedom to practicing the religious rights and respecting them according to the Bahraini law. So in general, these false claims by the Bahraini government, what we call it brainwash, political religious brainwash for the freedoms, is an evidence that the government doesn't want to actually implement any religious tolerance and religious justice as basics for the nationals. So we hope all of the activists, researchers, NGOs, universities, any governments who are into the Bahraini reality in general, not to be misled emotionally, not to be misled by the false political slogans for religious tolerance. They ought to truly read the reports by the Salam Foundation for Human Rights about the Shiite nationals in Bahrain and another report which you may find on their official website, in addition to other reports as the American Committee for Religious Freedoms. I welcome all my guests who are participating in this webinar. Mr. Zouhair Makhlouf will be the first speaker. Welcome, Mr. Zouhair. Mr. Zouhair, kindly check your speaker or microphone. Good evening. Mr. Zouhair Makhlouf, he is a member of parliament in Tunisia. is a member of parliament in Tunisia and an advisory board member in the Bahrain Forum for Human Rights. He will go thoroughly about the reality of religious freedoms and to what extent the Bahraini government is committed to.
هكذا جيد؟ جيد هكذا؟ جيد. للحقيقة أنا أردت أن أتدخل في هذا الشأن في
I wanted to point out in this regards, with regards to the headline of this webinar, considering that the religious rights which took place in Bahrain are and how they were neglected by the Bahraini government. It's a false understanding by the Bahraini government and the constitution, which actually guarantees the right to practice the religious rights according to the traditions led in Bahrain. This constitutional article also has to do with the Code of Penalties, Article 311, also guarantees the right to sanction any person who actually trespasses against any mosque or any religious rights practiced by any religious group. Since the Bahraini regime doesn't want to commit to its conventions and its constitution, that's why it sought some study committees falsely, like the Italian Veno's Institute, tried to justify or exclaim, like Oxford and Cambridge also deformed these standards and these human rights principles. I'd like to send a message through this webinar to all those who are watching us or listening to us, that the conventions which commit any regime around the world, especially in Bahrain, commits them to respect any religious rights and their practice. The first agreement, I'd like to read a part of it. The Convention of the United Nations on Human Rights, Article 13 and 55, obligates the respect for the human rights for their religions without any discrimination based on their race, their religion. Also, another article in 26 and 18, it states in another agreement also that the right to education to different categories, to different human beings, whatever their religions are. So the Universal Declaration on Human Rights states this right. It criminalizes the genocide issued in 1948 in Article 2 in defining the genocide. It states it's not permissible to partially or totally destroy any ethnic or religious groups, or it focuses on the violations. Also, the Convention on Refugees in 1951, in its 4th article, commits all the member states to sponsor and look after an equal treatment for different nationals inside the country in practicing their religious rights. Also, the Special Agreement on Stateless People, issued in 1951, in its Article 2005, or 205, also commits the states that the different educational institutions or establishments guarantees their right to spread their religion. Also, another agreement issued in 1965 also criminalizes the discrimination and guarantees the practice of the different rights, including the religious rights. Also, the agreement related to the economic, cultural rights, which was signed by the Bahraini authorities, states that the educational and moral religious education for the children is ought to be in charge by their own parents, so the authorities are not in charge for such education. So the Civil and Political Rights Convention in 1965, the 18th and 26th article also guarantees the right to practice any religion and practicing any rights. This was clear in this agreement, which was also signed by the Bahraini authorities. The agreement on eliminating any discrimination against the women had different articles, which also stated the obligation to allow persons to practice the religious rights and respecting the different religions. Also, the agreement on eliminating the discrimination, also the agreement on respecting the children's rights, which was also signed by the Bahraini authorities. In Article 16, it states, and in Article 14 also guarantees the right of the child to freely think, express. Also, the European Agreement on Protecting the Human Rights, issued in 1950, states in its 9th article, any individual rights, whether in religion or any religious rights, are not permitted to be violated. Also, the American Agreement in its Article 12 states this principle to respect the people's religions and the right to practice their rights. Also, the African Agreement on Human Rights in its articles issued in 1981, also the Arab Convention on Human Rights also stated these rights and principles in their articles. In their conference in Cairo, they declared the declaration in 1981, Article 12 and 18 states the right to religious freedom and the right to believe, and none of this should be violated by any party whatsoever. Article 18 in the Convention on the Human and Political Rights, it wasn't so clear. The United Nations formulated the declaration, I think in 1981, a small declaration of 10 points or 10 articles explaining this Article 18 or detailing it. The basis of this article that it focuses on the rights of the citizens to practice their religious rights. Practicing their religious rights were detailed in the Article 18 in this declaration, and they considered that relating this Universal Declaration on Civil Rights is a core and detailed article that all states are committed to. And Article 4 also states measures or necessary measures must be taken to respect these freedoms and criminalize discrimination based on religion or in race. Also, Article 5, it grants the child to have the total freedom to learn any religious education by his parents, and no authority shall hinder this. Also, in Article 5, it gives the right to manifest his religious rights. Article 7 guarantees that the local or national conventions guarantee these rights so that all the nationals or all the citizens enjoy these rights without any discrimination. This declaration also had another article on guaranteeing practicing these rights. This declaration cannot be falsely interpreted. They cannot false interpret it or explain it. Even the interpretation by the Oxford and Cambridge University and other institutes which are bought by money or bargained by money by the King Hamad or the different Gulf countries which used to buy these or the quittances of these by money, or even the Saudi regime. The Section 8 of this declaration criminalizes the false interpretation which tackles these rights, and therefore it commits all people to abide by the conventions which they signed, which I have mentioned some of, how it warns them not to misinterpret their meanings, the value meanings, the spiritual meanings for the citizens, which must be respected, and they shouldn't be misled or misinterpreted other than those mentioned in the conventions and agreements. And this declaration in specific, which included these rights in 10 articles: education, practice of religious rights, criminalizing any discrimination and manifestation of these religious rights. So it permits everything in this regard. Let me end up saying that the Bahraini regime considers the political wise that all of these meanings, all of these agreements are useless or don't mean a thing to it. Considering what the Shiite sect is practicing while practicing its religious rights, because they believe that these religious rights shall end up its regime. Therefore, it doesn't respect these religious rights, although they are not related to politics. However, they forbid these religious rights because they consider that these religious rights practiced have political dimensions, and this regime has done a lot of measures against this. Many mosques were destroyed, many people and clerics or reciters were arrested. A lot of reciters or ruwadid were arrested, those who recite the poetry. about their own religion. This is forbidden in Bahrain. It's so disgraceful in human history that the Bahraini regime practices all of this in order to defend its regime. Such measures don't guarantee that you keep your regime, because history shall wipe them off, geography and people shall wipe them off, and therefore I ask the Bahraini regime to abide to these agreements and conventions, or else they will be wiped off the people's hearts, and they are no longer trusted by their people. People don't trust their authority and the regime. They are only hanging to their own posts through the torture, unjust acts, even the arrested people who don't own any freedom or any rights. They don't have right to education. They also deprive them the right of praying and the right to practicing any of their religious rights. I'd like to say that I am from the Sunnite sect, but I highly respect the Shiite sect, and I consider that the Bahraini regime doesn't really belong to any of the religious acts, but the Zionist authorities they belong to, because they belong them historically through the normalization policies, and therefore I don't think that this regime has any religion or any rights that they believe in or any trust by people. Thank you, and my apologies if I got a little bit tense, but I have been following the measures and actions by the Bahraini regime, and I haven't seen any more devastating regime than this. Thank you, Mr. Zouhair Makhlouf. I'm not a doctor. I'm a member of parliament in Tunisia, so that the Bahraini regime would know that the member of parliament can state facts about this regime who are normalized with Israel. Now we are gonna be with Sheikh Husain Al-Akraf, who is a researcher and an Islamic reciter. Welcome. Sheikh Husain Al-Akraf now will talk about the methodological targeting in the Islamic or religious commemoration. He will describe what he was subject to in Bahrain, a personal experience. In the name of Allah the Almighty, and peace be upon Muhammad and his family and household. The COVID-19 pandemic also gave the opportunity to further restrictions on freedoms by the Bahraini regime. Practicing the religious rites were mostly restricted, considering it has mass gatherings, which require gatherings and group gatherings. I'm saying this because the history of this authority in targeting the religious freedoms isn't honest and isn't to be separated from the political targeting, but also a part of it. And whoever monitors this fact can measure the frequency of targeting the religious freedoms between two phases, when the authority and the opposition were okay together, or when they are fiercely fighting against each other, we can notice how they are further restricted when they are fighting against each other. So the phase after the convention and after annulation of most of the political committees or organizations gave a further freedom to an extent. And since I'm an Islamic reciter who has practiced the Husseini religious rites through the poetry for like 35 years, and I have been arrested since 5 years in between 1995 and 2000 and the renaissance of Al-Karama. So targeting the religious rights is a self-torture and tackling for any dignity for any person who demands human rights, and it trespasses the individual and targets the group and the community. I have a lot of testimonies, but I don't have enough time to go through them all. So I'm gonna go through 3 examples. When I was arrested in prison show number 2, I was reading some of the du'as and some of the Husseini poetries, and I was trying to have my voice heard by other prisoners in other cells. It was an evening or at night. We would take this chance when the police officers are busy in this time, having their dinner or having their comforts. Then the police would come and kick the door very fiercely and threatened me to remain silent or else he will sanction me. Then other 30 policemen would come with their weapons and they would open the different cells. Although he is well aware that I was the one who was reciting the dua and that the voice is coming from this cell specifically with number 64. However, they ended up punishing group-wise. They tortured the different prisoners in different cells, hitting them fiercely on their different parts of their bodies. This is one of the examples which I personally witnessed. The second example, when we were transferred to the Al-Qurain prison, we were prohibited from reviving Ashura or practicing Ashura, and we asked some of the prisoners who were with us to censor the place and let us know if they see any policemen coming, and we were threatened to be placed in these solitary cells. And this threat was later on implemented with me and with also other prisoners who were clerics or reciters or even poets. The last example I'd like to mention, when I was set free, I participated in one of the Ashura parades before the convention in the Sanabis, when Imam Ali commemoration martyrdom in Ramadan. In the morning, one of the security members came to me and asked me Adel Fleifel, the officer, wanted to see me at that point very early morning, and I went to see him. at the security of the state building, and I didn't know why. And once I entered, I was hit fiercely and I was placed at the solitary cell, and after hours the officer threatened me that he would arrest me if I didn't stop reciting at all, and he also obliged me to sign on a pledge for this. At that phase, a lot of Husseini parades and were assaulted, a lot of clerics, reciters also were arrested, and many Husseiniat and many Husseini parades were prevented. This lasted for around 3 years, as I recall. All of this reveals that targeting the religious rights and implementing further restrictions by the Bahraini regime is a part of a political revenge against the opposition people, and the COVID-19 pandemic is another opportunity for them to further restrict against any human rights, against any constitution articles or international conventions. The regime in this or nowadays work furthermore to further restrictions on the religious rights, are exploiting two main headlines. They're claiming that they are insulting some religious figures, and the second headline is that they are being a risk to the health precautions for the COVID-19. As for the first headline, the culture of the Bahraini people is based on respecting the different religious, and also in addition to us being the Shiite sect, we have clear fatwas or statements by our religious authorities or references which prevent us clearly from insulting any other religious sect. Also, even though we are being insulted and our religious figures are being insulted all the time without being punished at all. And as you mentioned in your introduction, these are double standards. What we want to signify to here that the regime is punishing based on the misleading, the historical misleading, which has nothing to do with the Shiite sect. They are basing their claims on historical falsification of the different religious sects, and they are taking statements which are rarely referred to, like these scholars. For example, they take the statements of Yazid, son of Muawiyah, the one who actually killed Imam Husain in Karbala. Most or all of the religious sects agree that he is a criminal, but they take his statements as a reference to punish us. Even the Saudi regime didn't take his statements as reference in punishing us. As I well know, but I know from my other colleagues, reciters or poets or clerics, that no one asked them about criminalizing Yazid for killing Imam Husain. This is very obvious about the political actual target or aim behind these restrictions, because the Bahraini authorities aren't religious, and this regime interprets falsely some of the religious statements for the ziyarat of Ashura, like the cursing which is mentioned in it are for the caliphs, although most of the Shiite clerics or authorities have frequently stated that the caliphs are not the ones who are referred to in the ziyarat, but this signifies that the cursing are for the people who have neglected the rights of Muhammad and his household and who have killed them, including Yazid, son of Muawiyah, who is well known to have been against Muhammad and his household. However, and despite all of this, the Bahraini regime falsely interprets this and therefore restricts the freedom of conscience. As for the second headline, which the regime exploits in this, the religious clerics stated the obligation to practice the religious rites within taking into consideration all the health precautions for the COVID-19 pandemic. As Sheikh Isa Ahmad Qasim, he stated that any place or any funerary service place shall be opened only upon taking into consideration the health precautions. And the people in charge for the funerary services actually did that. However, targeting against them didn't stop. And the Higher Council for Religious Practices have also stated that the mosques and the funerary services and the Husaini are to be reopened, taking into consideration the health precautions and to have a coordination between the Waqf and the Ministry of Justice. However, harassment against the religious practices and the religious rights even didn't stop. Finally, and in conclusion, we believe that there is a methodical targeting for the religious rights, especially for the Husseini rights, not linked to COVID-19 pandemic, or else explain to me why the speakers are prevented, why the banners are prevented, why webinars on Ashura are prevented. At the end, we thank God and thank you. Thank you, Sheikh Husain Al-Akraf, for your participation and for narrating your personal experiences, which show further the methodical restraints and punishments against the religious rights. There is a strategy to annul the Shiite identity in Bahrain. Now we will be with Mrs. Ghina Rebai, a researcher in the Bahrain Forum on Human Rights, who shall also monitor the religious targeting or persecution in Bahrain and the role of the Jafarite Waqf in Bahrain, knowing that the Jafari Waqf also had a statement with regards to this religious persecution.
أولاً حضرات المؤتمرين الكرام وجميع القائمين على تنظيم هذا المؤتمر والمشاهدين الكرام.
We thank all those who are watching, participants and those organizers.
لدى المسلمين الشيعة هو
The Shiite Muslims
الوقف الشرعي وفق مقررات
have
المذهب الشيعي.
we call administering the religious waqf, which states to appoint one of the places or the time according to specific terms. To be more clear, that in case they chose a place as a waqf, then it will only be stated to be used for a religious cause, and it won't be inherited. It will only be subject to special religious Shiite terms. The international laws grant the right to the different religions around the world to administer their waqfs according to their own regulations. However, the Bahraini regime confiscates the right to administer their waqf according to their own regulations, because this is a religious persecution practiced against the Shiite nationals, and the Jafarit Waqf for this year practiced a quite ambiguous role in restricting or restraining the commemoration of Ashura, which further confirms that this Waqf administration is not independent. However, the head and 10 members of it are appointed through a royal decree, and they refer back to the Minister of Justice, and therefore these appointments don't take into consideration any of the rights which are stated in the international laws, and they ignore explicitly any of the volunteers or the wills of the whole Shiite groups. As for the non-independence of the Jafarit Waqf, in 16 of August 2020, the head of Jafari Waqf, Yusuf Saleh al-Saleh, had a webinar or a meeting through Zoom with the founders of the funerary services in the presence of representatives of the Ministries of Interior and Ministry of Health. And during the meeting, they had stressed out that his administration is only an executive apparatus which goes back to the Ministry of Justice, and therefore it has nothing to do with independent decisions, and only executes the decisions of the Ministry of Interior. This confession by the head of the Jafari Waqf is one of its kind, because it explicitly expresses that the Jafari Waqf is not independent. Also, how the Jafari Waqf is one of the witnesses on the religious persecution. For example, no waqf can be built without an executive decision by the authorities, even if it was like a mosque in some LA, and it should be issued by royal decrees. This furthermore made further corruption politically and economically wise in the waqf. It cannot take any independent decision. In Hamad, in the area of Rebai, and before years, one of the lands in Rebai was registered in the name of Jafari Waqf. However, they were obliged to sell this very land to another party or another authority. Any mosque for the religious sect is a decision to be taken by the Minister of Justice, who shall sole decide whether he will grant this permission to build this mosque or not. Also, they take a lot of measures to hinder
منطقة الشويخ للمتابعة
the funerary services of Al-Husainiyat.
تقديمه طلب لهدم قبة
One
مأتم الشويخ في سنة
of
2012
the funerary
فإن
service
التقاعس
in
الإداري للجهات الرسمية
Al-Shuwaykh
تسبب بسقوط القبة قبة مأتم الشويخ وتضرر المبنى
and
الرئيسي
the dome,
في 17 مايو
which
2020
ended
يعني
up to cause the
حصل
dome in the building of
تم
this
استصدار
funerary service
لم يتم استصدار
fell
موافقات
down,
لازمة
which
ترميم لمدة
caused
8 سنوات.
a lot of destruction, although an application was provided to the Waqf for its restoration.
رؤساء الحسينيات لا يستطيعون عمل
The
أي
heads
شيء
of Al-Husainiyya
بالتصرف بالوقف
cannot
إلا باستشارة الأوقاف
deal
التي تعود
anything that has
لوزارة
to
العدل
do
كما قلنا
with
والتي تعود
Al-Waqf
بدورها باستشارة
without
وزارة الداخلية
counseling
وهو ما يؤكد أن إدارة
the
الوقف
Jafari Waqf,
تخضع
who
لنفوذ
themselves
الإدارة
have to go
الأمنية.
back to
ومن
the
الأمثلة
Ministry of
أيضا
Interior, and
رئيس
therefore
الأوقاف
they are
الجعفرية السابق
subject to
طلب
the
من وزارة
security
الداخلية
authorities.
تزويده
They're not
بتواريخ دخول ومغادرة
independent.
قيمي المساجد في البحرين. في 21 أغسطس
And
2020
21st of
دعت
August
إدارة الأوقاف
2020,
الجعفرية جميع
the
إدارات المآتم الخاصة بالرجال
board
إلى
of
تشكيل لجنة تنظيمية
Al-Jafari
وقت قراءة الحسينية لعدم
asked
السماح بالتجمعات في
the
محيط
Al-Husainiyya to
وذلك
not
بعد
allow any
فشل
gatherings
العناصر
in the
الأمنية لوزارة
surroundings
الداخلية
of
في منع التجمعات
these
الدينية
Al-Husainiyya
التي
after the
كانت
security
تجري
forces weren't
وفق
able to prevent
الاحترازات
them
الطبية المشددة
themselves,
وكان
although
يراد
these
من ذلك
gatherings
التسبب
were
بمشاكل اجتماعية.
taking into consideration the health precautions.
إن المؤسسات الوقفية لها شخصية اعتبارية وفقا للقانون المحلي والدولي حيث تنص
Al-Waqf
المادة
institutions
17
have their own or should have their own rights as Article 17 in the Bahraini constitution. A group of people or funds confessed or acknowledged by the law, and the civil law of Bahrain states that the moral person enjoys different or all rights within the law, and he shall have an independent right for money and right to legislate and have their own members and representatives. This means that Al-Waqf should have an independent figure. However, this is not the fact, and the mix that's going on with the funds of the Waqf and other institutions is a big violation for this article. And despite what Basuni reports and other reports documented and destruction of around 5% of the mosques which are registered under the Al-Jafari Waqf, which clearly states that this Waqf isn't able to protect these mosques. Al-Barbaghi Mosque, for example, which ages 405 years, is a violation according to the UNESCO, which stated that all the states which should implement measures in order to protect the religious and historical monuments or places. Thank you. Thank you for your participation, Ms. Rebai. This is a very dangerous statement by that the Al-Jafari Waqf aren't independent, and they refer directly to the Ministry of Interior, especially after Yusuf As-Saleh, the head of Al-Jafari Waqf, stated very simply that the administration of Al-Jafari Waqf is an executive apparatus which refers back or belongs to the Ministry of Justice. This is first of its kind for a clear violation which states the dependency of Al-Jafari Waqf for political aims and political targets by the Bahraini regime. Thank you, Mrs. Rebai, for your participation. Now we shall be with Sayyid Abbas Shubbar, the head of Religious Freedoms Committee in the Salam Organization for Democracy and Human Rights. Welcome, Sayyid Abbas.
الآن جيد الصوت.
جيد.
أهلا ومرحبا.
أهلا بكم، مرحبا بكم سيد عباس.
أهلا ومرحبا بكم، حياكم.
سيد عباس، سوف يعني يتم الآن عن طريقه يعني تدشين تقرير حول
Now we shall launch the report which has to do with the employment of COVID-19 pandemic for the religious persecution. Sayyid Abbas will give us a brief on this report. You may follow this webinar on the direct link on Twitter, Twitter page for Salam, and on the Lu'la'a TV and
أهلا ومرحبا بكم جميعا.
the live broadcast.
جميع المشاركين في هذه الندوة وكذلك
Good evening to all the participants in this webinar and all of those listening or following us. And we thank all the organizers for having this webinar. I'd like to start with the small introduction. The human rights reality in Bahrain is one of its kind because it is going through a lot of deterioration. On one hand, the territory of Bahrain is wealthy in petroleum, and there is a specific geopolitical aspect for this, where the Shiite group are considered a majority, which gave the Bahraini regime, as they believe, the right to marginalize this group and subjecting restraints on practicing their religious rights. And the Bahraini regime takes over all the wealth and all the decisions, which reflected on the annual deteriorating reality, whether in Ashura time or in other cultural periods which have to do with this religious group as a basic component in Bahrain. Now I shall give you a brief on this report. The Bahraini regime since 2011, and especially in the months of Muharram and Safar in the Hijri year, have always practiced a group punishment against the Shiite nationals in Bahrain through methodological punishments or restraints for the religious rights. And due to the complication of the human rights, one of the examples is restraints on the prisoners who want to practice the religious rights, assaults against any Ashura banners or slogans, or even wearing the black outfits, arresting or imprisoning the reciters or the ruwadids, the heads of the Husainiyas, and mistreating them, summoning them to the security centers to investigate with them in their speeches, also in the content of their poems in Ashura, assaulting the funerary services with tear gas or the splitting bullets, or even preventing the central prayer, gathering mass prayer in the evening of Ashura, even criminalizing the opinions of the clerics on historical facts related to the Islamic history and other harassments. It's very important to point out that these aggressions are based on a political decision and a general methodology for the authorities and not an individual practice only. This year, violations were disseminated as follows: prevention of opening the Husainiyas, exercising force to prevent the funerary services, taking out the banners, summoning the reciters and the heads of the Hussainiyas, closures of the mosques and a lot of Hussainiyas, and seeking to close others, calling others and threatening them, those in charge for the Hussainiyas. These are only examples. The legal obligation for the state in protecting the religious rights. Practicing the religious rights is a right for every individual group or religious sect as stated in their own religion. And since the Shiite Jafari nationals have their own practices, own religious practices, then the state must protect these and guarantee that they practice these rights as the religious sect states without any intervention, because this right was stated by the Bahraini constitution and also stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in its Article 18, and also other international conventions and the Arab and Islamic and international states. This right may have a specific or a private aspect, like the mass gatherings in Ashura. So any circumstance which happens or incident which happens, those competent people in the same sect will decide upon it, just like the pandemic COVID-19. It requires a clear coordination between the authorities on one hand and the Islamic Jafarite clerics on the other hand. So when the authorities try to subject restraints to annul the commemoration of Ashura, this is a very grave violation for the practice of the religious rights, and therefore the state must take on its obligation, because it tries to not acknowledge the rights of the religious sect, and the scholars of the sect are the ones competent to decide upon this, and they didn't refer back to them in the decisions and in the measures taken, and also not using force with the mourners. This is a legal obligation guaranteed by Article 22 of the Bahraini Constitution, which states the freedom of conscience absolutely, and the state guarantees the sanctuary or sanctity of the religious places like the mosques, as traditions and customs suggest. Also, many incidents were mentioned in this report, which you may read through. It's published on the website of Salam and the Bahrain Forum website, as well as other websites which you will check through the Salam account. Also, there is the arbitrary imprisonment for several nationals. The report mentions them. This imprisonment included the person in charge for Al-Zahra Mosque in Hamad. I shall mention an example, who was arrested because he hanged 2 Ashura banners. Then he was set free after he removed these banners. Also, the arrest of Sheikh Ibrahim Al-Ansari, who is still arrested up to this date. Citizen Abdul Nabi As-Samak is still arrested. Citizen Nassr Ali Al-Nassr. around 7 people from Dar Kulay were arrested because they hanged flags and banners for Ashura, and they were set free after they signed a pledge to remove them. The security orders to close the Hussainis and the mosques, which were around 5, Shuhada Ataf in the area of Al-Nu'aym, Sayyida Khadija Mosque in Hamad area, also the Mosque of Zahra in Hamad, in this section 5. Also, it was closed by the Ministry of Interior, the mosque and the center of Imam Hassan and the area of Sadat, and there were a lot of obstruction attempts to prevent the funerary manifestations, and they prevented the speakers and the funerary center in Sanabas. And as Sheikh Husain Al-Akraf has mentioned, there is totally no relation between the speakers of the mosques or the Hussainiyas and the COVID-19 pandemic. Also preventing the speakers in the funeraries of and the capital Al-Manama, also asking to remove the chairs for the mourners outside the funerary of Imam Ali in the area of Al-Zair. There are a lot of summons also, which we don't have enough time to mention all of them. There were also monitoring for some of the summons, like the summons for the heads of the committees in Al-Sidra region, and threatening them if they opened the funerary services for the commemoration of Ashura. Also summoning all the heads of Al-Musalla to investigate a banner in the name of Imam Husain. Also summoning the head of the funerary service in Al-Nu'aym. A lot of houses also in the northern area where their people were asked to be summoned because they hanged banners for Ashura, which is one of the traditions in Bahrain, to hang black flags or black banners in expression for their sadness for Imam Husain. Also summoning the persons in charge for the funerary service in Al-Manama, Shuhada Ataf, and threatening them to deprive them of their civil rights, and investigating with some of the people in Karzakan region for heading their annual parade to Al-Malkiya, and informing them that the Al-Jafari Waqf only permits you to do this parade in the surrounding of the place. These are only a few examples. Also removing flags and banners related to Ashura and Ras Rumman and Karzakan, 6 times in Al-Dir area, Sidra region also, and after the governor of the capital and telephoned the Hussainiyas there, asked them to remove the flags and remove the black banners in these regions. Also in Al-Hamad, the 10th round points, also in the region near the mosque of Al-Qasasib. And in order not to take further time, this report shall be published on the website of Salam
أهم شيء الآن أذكر التوصيات التي
I shall mention their recommendations
ذكرها هذا التقرير
which are mentioned in this report. The Bahraini government should stop the religious persecution and stop implementing restrictions on the practice of religious rights. The government should draft and enact laws that criminalize the enactment on religious rights and holding all those accountable who violate these rights. The government shouldn't also interfere with any affairs regarding the funerary services and the Husainiyat, including the freedom to practice within public. Also, the government should allow the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief to visit the Bahrain. We also have the member states of the Human Rights Council and the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to support the Shiite citizens' right to exercise the freedom of religion and belief in Bahrain without any restraints. Also, question any those involved and be held accountable for their violations on religious freedoms, especially concerning the commemoration of Ashura. Thank you for listening, and we pray that we thank God. Thank you, Sayyid Abbas, for this brief, for the report to be launched by Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. I shall remind all of those following us, as Sayyid Abbas mentioned, that this report shall be published on the official website of Salam for Democracy. So you may refer back to the website to read it. Thank you, Sayyid Abbas, for your participation. Now we shall Now we shall be with a short film on the religious persecution in Ashura commemoration in the month of Muharram. It's a short movie which documents the human rights violations.
ومحاولاتها المتكررة استهداف الموسم والمظاهر والشعائر المتعلقة به. والثاني إصرار من نوع آخر، المواطنون الشيعة عازمون على إحياء هذه المناسبة الأليمة مهما يكن الظرف ومهما اشتدت القبضة الأمنية، بشعار العقيلة زينب عليه السلام: والله لن تمحو ذكرنا. هي حرب على الحسين، أما أشكالها الرسمية فمتعددة. الاستهداف تقوم به عدة مؤسسات وأجهزة رسمية، من الأوقاف الجعفرية إلى وزارة العدل والمجلس الأعلى للشؤون الإسلامية. تبدأ اعتداءاتها على المظاهر الحسينية، تزيل السواد من رايات وأعلام ولافتات حتى تلك التي تحمل شعار عاشوراء، تخرب المضائف وتزيل الخيام والنشرات الحسينية. هذا العام تفردت البحرين بأشكال التضييق تزامنا مع انتشار الوباء. بدأ الأمر بمنع التجمعات العاشورائية حصرا، أغلقت المآتم وغيرت أقفال بعضها، ووصل الأمر إلى تحديد وقت بث الخطبة ومنع مكبرات الصوت والسواد حتى فوق المنازل بحجة كورونا. مناطق عديدة شهدت اعتداءات على مظاهر السواد كرأس رمان والسهلة الجنوبية وسماهيج والمدينة الشمالية ومدينة حمد وكرزكان التي شهدت إزالة اللافتات لسماحة آية الله الشيخ عيسى قاسم. أما منطقة صار فطلب نزع الأعلام فيه فعالية خاصة بالذكرى عبر قنوات المساجد على اليوتيوب، ومنع أي بث يتم بالتعاون مع مآتم أخرى أغلقتها وتم تغيير أقفال بعضها. أما الاستدعاءات فطالت علماء وخطباء ورواديد ورؤساء مآتم وأصحابها وحتى مواطنين على خلفية وضع رايات سوداء على منازلهم، من واستدعاءات على خلفية العزل موكب السنابس الموحد، موكب المنامة الموحد، قيم جامعة الزهراء استدعى خلال اجتماع مفاجئ في نادي الضباط في المنامة وإدارات مآتم عراد في المركز الأمني، حيث تم استدعاء القائمين عليه للتوقيع على إفادة بعدم الخروج. تحذير عبر اتصال للملكية بعدم الخروج في موكب مركزي يوم 9. تحذير عبر اتصال المحافظ ثانوي إلى الملكية وتأكيد إفادة الأوقاف بالسماح للمواكب فقط في محيط المأتم. تحذير من الأوقاف الجعفرية لمأتم ستر أسفالة بسبب كثافة المستمعين في الخارج. طلب المحافظة من ستر الخارجية وديان إزالة أي سواد على متعلقات الوزارة، كما تم إغلاق الدين من 3 منافذ قبيل العزاء السنوي في 11 من المحرم. أمام هذا الضغط كله كان النبض العلمائي والشعبي واحدا، وأظهرته مشاهد الإحياء مع مؤخرا التدخل، فالإحياء لم يتوقف، وكلمة الحسين ورايته بقيتا خفاقتين كما في كل عام وستبقيان. هذا قرار البحرينيين الذين يؤكدون على مر الأعوام أن الحسين تاريخ، والتاريخ لا يموت، ولا يمكن لأحد مهما زاد اضطهاده وبطشه أن يميته.
على بث الفيديو القصير حول استهداف الشعائر الحسينية والشعائر
on the religious persecution for the practice of religious rights now.
المحاضرين والمحاضرات الأعزاء، إذا عندكم مداخلة
If any of the participants have any further comments
شيء حول يعني مداخلتكم حول الاستهداف الديني بصفة عامة أو استهداف عاشوراء
on the religious persecution in general or the persecution in Ashura in particular,
يتفضل أحد منكم إذا في مداخلة أو شيء يعني.
if you have any further comments, please.
سيد عباس.
سيد عباس.
أو الأستاذ نائب زهير مخلوف أو
Member of Parliament Zouhair Makhlouf and Mrs. Ghina Rebai.
الشيخ حسين أكرف
زهير مخلوف الظاهر كأنما أيضا غير موجود. نعم.
أخت الأستاذة غنا رباعي.
Mrs. Ghina Rebai, are you still with us?
سيد عباس. أظن سؤالي يوجه لكم إذا ما عندكم إضافات.
نعم تفضل.
I have a question for you if you have no further comments.
نعم سيد عباس تسمعنا؟
نعم.
أسمع. هناك مزاعم للدولة البحرينية.
There are claims for the Bahraini state, claims on the religious tolerance in Bahrain and the state's efforts to respect these religious rights and enforce them. However, in reality, how did this targeting and persecution begin? How can we see its manifestations, especially with the external policies of Bahrain geopolitical? Is there an international pressure against Bahrain, or that Bahrain is taking a pretext as terrorism to target the religious centers and the religious figures, or anything that's related to the Shiite identity in Bahrain?
طبعا أنا في بداية
As I have mentioned before, I spoke about the location of Bahrain. It has a special aspect because Bahrain is located in an extremely important petroleum area. This area has impact whether on the political international fact or the regional fact as well. There are a lot of contradictions in the region, and these contradictions based to an extent this problem that exists nowadays in Bahrain. As you well know, Bahrain has a special aspect, a bit different than the other Gulf countries, since this very small country, most of its nationals belong to a specific religious sect, which is the Shiite sect. And the neighbor state for Bahrain is Saudi Arabia, which is a very big country and has a big impact on the Islamic reality. And the other neighbor state is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which also has a great impact on the Islamic reality and the international reality as well, which makes the Shiite in Bahrain in a very difficult position. So preventing them from their freedoms, considering that they are a majority in Bahrain, will be justified on one hand by the authority, because this majority is or belong to a religious sect close to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they will be impacted, or they will have a certain impact on the Shiite nationals of Bahrain, as the authorities frequently state any problem, they would just mention Iran. Even after the fall of Saddam, Iraq, as the other country, is condemned because they follow one party or another. This is quite normal, which we tackle and the policies followed by these authorities against the major component, which is the Shiite component in Bahrain. Thank you, Said Abbas. I don't think we have spoke enough about the hate speech against the Shiite sect in Bahrain and the prisoners of Shia in Bahrain, which is a grave violation for the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. In Bahrain, do you sense a hate speech just by the authorities or also by other components? The other components, like those fake Twitter accounts or some political figures which are manipulated by the Bahraini authorities in order to mitigate the Bahraini community and further fuel it up against the Shia, which is known by everyone, by the Shiite sects and the Sunnite sects. There are some known figures for this, and there are other facts that most of those who work in the media, whether they were journalists or media figures, according to the terms, they don't belong to Bahrain. They are not Bahraini nationals, but they were granted the Bahraini nationalities in some specific time periods. But since, and between two brackets, they are considered as they belong to the Sunnite sects in Iran. So they try to launch some campaigns assaulting the Shiite nationals in Bahrain in order to justify that they are loyal to the Bahraini regime, in order to satisfy the authority and not for the sake, not because they actually believe in what they're defending. Thank you, Sayyid Abbas, for your participation and for the valued information. Thank you for all who followed us. Thank you for all the organizers for this webinar and the short film. The live broadcast will be published on YouTube for the Salam for Democracy, as well as the report in Arabic and English languages will be published. I would conclude with a recommendation included in the report to ask the Bahraini government to stop the religious persecution and the restrictions on the practice of religious rights in respect for the international rights and conventions which they have abided to, and respect the different religious sects in Bahrain and actual religious tolerance to have peace for everyone in Bahrain. Thank you all for following this webinar. And until we meet in another webinar on human rights in Gulf countries or Bahrain. Thank you.